Hello, everyone. I am Mrs. Myers, and I will be doing your ACT Science practice this week. I teach AP Bio, AP Environmental Science, and Honors Bio. This week, we are going to do a dueling scientist passage, which are the ACT Science passages that do not have any pictures or graphs. They just compare different scientists' opinions about how something in science works. This is often one that people think are challenging, so it'll be a good one for you to practice. Please open the link if you'd like to view the full passage. This is not from a real ACT. This is from a practice ACT that's geared more towards freshmen and sophomores. The last thing I want to point out before we start is that you probably don't want to do these questions in order, because if you read the entire passage, you might not understand exactly what it's saying. It's going to be pretty intense science jargon. So I would recommend finding which part of the passage each question is talking about and doing those in order instead. So for example, I would probably do the scientist 1 questions first. So I would start with question 4 and question 7. You can see question 4 asks about scientist 1, question 7 also asks about scientist 1. I would just focus on this passage here and this section of the passage and do those 2 first. Then I would do question 1, which is about scientist 2. So I only have to look at this section for question 2, or question 1 about scientist 2. You know what I mean? And then I would do the ones that have all of the scientists or multiple scientists last. So then I'd probably do question 5 because it asks about 1 and 2. And then I would do 2 and 3 last. You can say they ask about all 3 of the scientists and the answer choices. So this would be good to save towards the very end. Okay. The last thing I want to point out before you actually start is that each of these 3 passages have similar information in similar places. So for example, at the beginning, they'll talk about snowmelt. This one talks about snowmelt. This one talks about snowmelt. This one does not talk about snowmelt. So these 2 have snowmelt in common. At the end, they have a summarizing sentence that summarizes why the rocks are moving. And so this last sentence summarizes how the 3 scientists differ and what they think is causing the rocks to move. So these 3 passages are set up with the same information in the same order. So if you're trying to compare the scientists, for example, questions 2, 3, and 5, find similar parts like the beginning, the middle, or the end, and you'll find the same info. All right. Please take 5 minutes and try that passage on your own, and then we will check your answers. Okay. Question 4 asks, suppose it was discovered that a particular rock formed a 200-meter long trail in 72 hours. Would this support scientist 1's explanation? So we're focused on scientist 1, so we're focused just on this section of the passage, okay? And they say a 200-meter long trail in 72 hours. So I'm going to skim for meters and time, and I see here in scientist 1, let's see if we see meters and time. Scientist 1 does say the rock should be able to move several hundred meters in a few days, which does sound like what they're talking about. 200 to several hundred in a few days is 72 hours. So yes, this is supported by what Scientist 1 says. The answer should be G. Yes, they can move several hundred meters in a few days. The only difference between F and G was the time, and they say days, so G is the better answer here. Okay. Question 7, based on Scientist 1's explanation, again, we are on Scientist 1, this section here only. A rock trail that's 33 centimeters wide was most likely made by a rock of what width? Okay, so I'm looking for wide is the keyword that I'm skimming for. Remember, you're not reading this to completely understand it. You're skimming it to find answers, like a hunter. All right, so here we find that they say the rocks are about 2/3 or the trails are about as 2/3 wide as the rocks themselves. So if the trail is 33 centimeters, the rock itself will be a little bit bigger. 33 centimeters might be 2/3. And so 3/3, the whole rock. If 33 is 2/3, about half of 33 is about 16. So 1/3 is about 16. You could do 16 times 3-ish to get about 3/3 the whole rock, which is 50. If you're just estimating, you know that it would not be A or B because A and B are smaller. than how big you would expect it, because it says the rocks are bigger than the trail. So you knew it would have to be C or D. And D is over twice as big, and we're only looking for about 30% larger. So the answer for 7 is C. All right. Question 1. According to scientist 2, so we're focused on just scientist 2 right now, friction between the rocks and the clay was reduced by which of the following? All right, so I'm looking for friction. Here I see friction. And it says that the presence of mud and algae reduces the friction. So here our answer would be mud and algae. 1 should be D. Okay. Number 6 is, suppose that air temperature in the playa varies between 4 degrees and 47 degrees Celsius. Would this support scientist 2? Okay, so I'm looking at scientist 2. I'm gonna look for something about temperature. Okay, here it says temperature does not get cold enough for ice to form. Ice forms at 0 degrees Celsius. Sometimes they're just facts that the ACT expects you to know, and that is one of the facts. Ice forms at 0 degrees Celsius. Is this cold enough for ice? No, these are too warm for ice. So number 6 should be F. It does support them. Ice cannot form in this temperature range. It's too warm for ice. All right. Question 5. Suppose that during 1 year, there was no measurable movement of any rocks in the playa during the spring. Scientists 1 and 2 would most likely both agree that this was due to the absence of which of the following. So we're looking at 1 and 2. And what's something that they both agreed was important? Remember, you'll have important information in the same spot. Here in their first introductory sentences, they both named snowmelt as being important, whereas scientist 3 does not have anything about snowmelt. So the answer for 5 is B. Okay. Number 2 asks, suppose a researcher observed that wind speeds greater than 80 miles an hour, so that's pretty fast wind, are needed to move the rocks in the playa. This is consistent with which scientists' observation or explanations. Now, I know they all had a summarizing sentence at the end. So I'm going to look at their summarizing sentences at the end, and I'm going to see which ones mention high winds, because 80 miles an hour is pretty high. Scientist 1 says light winds. So I don't think scientist 1 is going to agree that 80 miles an hour is required. Scientist 2 says strong winds. So scientist 2 would agree with that. And scientist 3 says strong winds. So scientist 3 would also agree. So our answer for number 2 should be H, 2 and 3 only. Scientist 1 is only looking for light winds, not 80 miles an hour. That's like very strong. All right, last question is question 3. Suppose that no seismic activity was recorded in the playa. Seismic activity, that is a term that the ACT would expect you to recognize. Seismic activity means earthquakes, right? It was recorded in the playa when the trails left by rocks were found. This would weaken which scientist, okay? Only one of the scientists talked about seismic activity. They're talking about tectonic plates and shifts in the plates causing the rocks to move. So our answer for number 3 would be B, scientist 3 only. All right, thank you for watching. I hope that you learned something. And remember, you don't have to do the questions in order. Do them in the order that would be most beneficial to you. Maybe take one scientist at a time.